He is just a businessman with expensive suits. He is too refined to be a monster. You have no idea what monsters are willing to do to keep what is theirs. Nyla Brooks didn't flinch when the syndicate surrounded her family at the gala. She flinched when her new husband, Park Tae-hyun, leaned in and whispered the one sentence that froze the blood in her veins. She knew her life had a price the moment she saw the dragon tattoo creeping up his neck like a warning. But it wasn't until their wedding night, trapped in a penthouse suite overlooking the neon lights of Seoul, that the mask finally slipped. He wasn't just a savior. He wasn't just a husband. And when he stepped into her space, his hand pressing against the cold glass of the window behind her, she finally understood. She hadn't been saved from a debt. She had been claimed by the very man who owned the debt, and he was never letting her go. Welcome back to the Afrokoreanstoryspace, besties. Today's story is a special request for a dark, high-stakes romance that proves some protection comes with a terrifying price. If you're watching right now, drop a black heart in the comments to show Nyla some love as she navigates the dangerous world of the Park Syndicate. To my loyal besties, a fair warning. If you click away before the end of Chapter 7, you'll spend all night wondering what Tae-hyun whispered in that suite. Trust me, the secret he's holding over her is more shocking than the wedding itself. Let's get into it. The air in the grand ballroom of the Lotte Hotel was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying chill of industrial-strength air conditioning. Nyla smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, her dark skin glowing under the crystal chandeliers, unaware that she was walking through a graveyard of her father's ambitions. This was the Gala of Ghosts, a night where the elite of Seoul gathered to hide their sins behind champagne flutes. She remembered the way her father's hand had trembled when he handed her a glass of sparkling water. He wasn't looking at the stage or the performers. He was looking at the shadows near the back of the room. Following his panicked gaze, Nyla saw him for the first time. Park Tae-hyun didn't blend into the crowd. He commanded it by simply existing in a state of absolute stillness. He was sharply dressed in a black suit that looked like armor, his dark hair styled with lethal precision. Even from a distance, the tattoo crawling up his neck looked like a dark vine reaching for his jaw, a permanent mark of a man who didn't play by the rules of polite society. The music seemed to fade into a dull hum when Tae-hyun began to move. He crossed the room with the grace of a predator, his broad shoulders cutting a path through the socialites who instinctively stepped aside. When he reached them, Nyla's father didn't just greet him. He bowed so low it looked like he was begging for his life. "The interest has doubled, Brooks," Tae-hyun said, his voice a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in Nyla's chest. He didn't look at her father. His piercing eyes were locked onto Nyla, studying her with the cold, calculated intensity of a man inspecting a prized acquisition. I need more time," her father stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "The trading scheme. The investors." Tae-hyun stepped closer, invading Nyla's personal space until she could smell his expensive, woodsy cologne. He ignored the older man's pleas, his focus remaining entirely on the woman in the emerald dress. He reached out, his gloved finger tracing the line of her collarbone. The touch wasn't affectionate. It was a mark of possession. "Time is a luxury you've already spent," Tae-hyun whispered, his gaze dropping to Nyla's parted lips. "But you have something I find far more valuable than paper currency." In that moment, under the glittering lights of the gala, Nyla realized she wasn't a guest. She was the currency. Her father's silence was her confirmation. The debt wasn't going to be paid in one. It was going to be paid in her life. Tae-hyun leaned in until his lips nearly brushed her ear, the heat of his breath a sharp contrast to the ice in his eyes. "Smile for the cameras, Nyla," he murmured. "From tonight, you belong to the Park Syndicate." The transition from the glittering gala to the heavy mahogany-paneled walls of Park Tae-hyun's private office felt like moving from a dream into a tomb. Nyla stood in the center of the room, her emerald dress now feeling like a costume for a play she never auditioned for. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock and the scratching of a fountain pen against thick, cream-colored parchment. Taehyun sat behind a desk carved from dark wood that looked as ancient and unyielding as the man himself. He didn't look up as he finished signing his name in bold, precise strokes. On the desk lay 3 copies of a contract, documents Nyla barely understood, written in both English and Korean. They were the papers that would formalize her family's protection in exchange for her absolute cooperation. "Sit," he commanded, not as a request, but as an observation of what was about to happen. Nyla remained standing, her jaw set in a line of defiance that felt increasingly brittle. "You talk about protection, but you're holding a pen like a weapon. My father owes you money, not a human being." Taehyun finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes devoid of warmth. He didn't rise, but the sheer weight of his presence made the room feel smaller. "Your father owes more than money, Nyla. He owes his life to men who do not have my patience. If you do not sign, he will not leave this building. Your sisters back home will find their protection retracted by sunrise." The mention of her family sent a chill through her veins. She looked at the pen, a heavy, gold-trimmed instrument that felt like a hot iron. To Taehyun, this was a business transaction, a prized acquisition to be added to his ledger. To Nyla, it was the end of her autonomy. She stepped forward, her dark fingers trembling as she reached for the pen. As she leaned over the desk, Taehyun's hand suddenly shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute, a physical reminder of the predator she was now tethered to. "When you sign this," he whispered, his voice dropping to that dangerous low hum, "you aren't just settling a debt. You are becoming a park. You will move when I say move. You will stay when I say stay. You are mine, Nyla Brooks. Not by blood, but by ink." Nyla met his gaze, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears and a flicker of remaining fire. She pulled her wrist from his grasp and pressed the nib to the paper. The ink bled into the fibers, dark and permanent. With every loop of her signature, she felt the walls of her life closing in, moving from the freedom of her past to the gilded cage of the Park Syndicate. She set the pen down with a sharp click. The deal was done. She was no longer a daughter, a student, or a woman with a choice. She was a contract signed in blood and ink, waiting for the wedding night that would seal her fate. The hotel suite was a cathedral of white silk and cold marble, but to Nyla, it felt like a dressing room for an execution. She stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her reflection a stranger she didn't want to know. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of minimalist elegance, sleeveless, stark white, and clinging to her curves like a second skin. It was beautiful, yet it felt like a shroud. Her hair had been styled into soft, polished waves that caught the light, and her jewelry was subtle, whispering of a wealth she had never asked for. Her fingers, still trembling from the memory of the contract signing, moved to the neckline of the gown. There, stitched into the ivory fabric, was a bold red accent. It was a splash of crimson that sat right against her pulse point. To the designers, it was a pop of color, a modern stylistic choice. To Nyla, it was a warning. It was the color of the blood her father had almost spilled, the color of the ink she had used to sign her life away, and the color of the danger that lived behind Park Taehyun's eyes. She stared at the red silk, her wide eyes reflecting a terror she couldn't hide. Every time she looked at that crimson streak, she saw the dark angel who had claimed her. She thought of the way he had studied her at the gala, his gaze like a predator evaluating its prey. The red accent felt like a target on her chest. It was a mark of ownership, a sign that she was now part of a world where violence was the primary language and her body was the peace treaty. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of Seoul's traffic far below. Nyla pressed her hand against the red fabric, feeling her heart hammering beneath it. She wasn't just a bride, she was a sacrifice. The white of the dress represented the purity of the transaction, but the red was the reality of the Park Syndicate. It was the cold, calculated truth that she had been traded for protection. A soft knock at the door made her breath catch. The time for reflection was over. She had to walk down the aisle and face the man who moved with the grace of a predator. As she took one last look in the mirror, she didn't see a woman ready for a wedding. She saw a woman prepared for war. The crimson accent stood out like a fresh wound against the white silk, a permanent reminder that in Taehyun's world, survival was the only thing that mattered. She lifted her chin, forcing a mask of stoicism over her fear, and stepped toward the door. The chapel was an architectural masterpiece of cold stone and sharp angles, tucked away from the prying eyes of the public. Inside, there was no celebratory music, no scent of flowers, only the heavy, oppressive silence of men who lived by the gun. As Nyla walked down the aisle, her white dress rustling against the marble, she felt 1,000 eyes on her. They weren't guests. They were the Mafia hierarchy. Rows of men in identical black suits sat with their hands folded, their faces devoid of emotion, watching her like judges presiding over a sentencing. Her father stood at the front, his head bowed, refusing to meet her gaze. He looked small and broken in this room of giants. But it was the man waiting at the altar who drew all the light and warmth out of the air. Park Taehyun stood with his hands behind his back, his presence so massive it seemed to shrink the vaulted ceilings. The tattoo on his neck was a dark contrast to his crisp white collar, a reminder of the predator who had bought her freedom with her soul. When she reached him, he didn't take her hand with tenderness. He gripped her fingers with a firm, possessive strength that made her breath hitch. The ceremony was conducted in a low, rhythmic Korean that Nyla didn't understand, but she didn't need a translator to know what was happening. She was signing her life away in a language of power and blood. There were no smiles from the onlookers. There was only the calculated stillness of a business merger. As they exchanged rings, bands of heavy, cold platinum, Taehyun leaned in. For a moment, Nyla thought he might kiss her, but he simply looked into her wide, terrified eyes with a gaze that was both clinical and intense. She saw the steel-gray eyes that had studied her as a prized acquisition months ago in Seoul. Her own hand, resting against his chest, felt the steady, unwavering thrum of his heart. He wasn't nervous. He was a man who had finally secured his most valuable asset. The officiant spoke the final words, and the room remained silent. There was no applause, only the sound of 100 men rising in unison as the Park Syndicate's new, claimed bride was presented. Taehyun didn't lead her back down the aisle. He steered her toward a side exit, his hand firm on the small of her back. The silent vows were over, and as the heavy oak doors closed behind them, Nyla realized the chapel had been the easy part. The true terror was waiting in the private hotel suite, where the mask of the ceremony would finally be stripped away. The doors of the elevator glided shut with a silent, pressurized hiss, sealing Nyla and Taehyun into a small, mirrored box of polished gold. The ascent was so smooth it was sickening, signaled only by the glowing digital numbers climbing toward the top floor. In the reflection of the golden panels, Nyla saw the contrast of her own wide, fearful eyes against Taehyun's absolute composure. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders filling the narrow space, a predator in a tuxedo. Nyla looked down at her hands, her dark skin shimmering against the white silk of her dress, but all she could focus on was the heavy weight of the platinum band on her finger. Felt like a shackle. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a physical presence that seemed to swallow the air in the small enclosure. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic thrum of the motor. She was trapped in a gilded cage that was moving higher and higher above the safety of the world she once knew. "You have been very quiet, Nyla," Taehyun said, his deep voice slicing through the stillness. He didn't turn to look at her, but his gaze was fixed on her reflection in the gold-tinted mirror. "What do you want me to say?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain stoic. "Thank you for buying me. Thank you for making my father a beggar in his own skin." Taehyun finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate as he stepped into her personal space. He backed her against the mirrored wall, his shadow looming over her like a dark cloud. "I did not buy you to hear your gratitude," he murmured, his slight Korean accent making the words feel even more foreign and dangerous. I bought you to ensure the park name remains undisputed. Your father made a choice to gamble with things he did not own. I simply collected the debt. Nyla pressed her back against the cool metal, her hand instinctively resting on his chest as if to push him away, though she knew she was powerless. Beneath the fine fabric of his shirt, she felt the steady, iron-hard beat of his heart. The elevator chimed, a soft melodic sound that signaled they had reached the penthouse. The doors slid open to reveal a suite of glass and marble, the glittering skyline of Seoul spread out like a sea of diamonds behind the windows. As he stepped out, pulling her with him by the hand, Nyla looked back at the elevator. The doors were already closing, the golden light flickering out. There was no exit. Her passport was in his possession, her family's safety depended on her submission, and she was now truly alone with a man who had claimed her for something far more terrifying than marriage. The penthouse suite was a silent expanse of shadows and moonlight, designed with a cold, minimalist perfection that offered no comfort to its new inhabitant. Taehyun moved into the center of the room, his silhouette cutting a sharp, intimidating figure against the backdrop of the city lights. Without a word, he began to unbutton his tailored suit jacket, his movements slow and rhythmic, carrying the grace of a predator that Nyla had come to fear. Nyla stood by the edge of the plush rug, her dark fingers trembling against the white silk of her dress. As the jacket fell away, followed by his waistcoat, she found herself unable to look away. He turned slightly to toss the garments onto a leather chair, and the soft ambient light caught the side of his neck. The tattoo she had glimpsed earlier wasn't just a small mark. It was the tail of a great dragon that spiraled downward, disappearing beneath the collar of his white shirt. When he reached for his cufflinks, the sleeves of his shirt retreated, revealing more than just ink. Across his forearms were jagged lines of silver, scars that spoke of a history far more violent than any business meeting could suggest. These weren't the marks of a man who sat behind a desk. These were the marks of a man who had survived the underground business circles of Korea through sheer, brutal force. Taehyun began to unfasten the top buttons of his shirt, and Nyla's breath caught in her throat. Beneath the fine cotton, the dragon's body coiled across his broad shoulders and chest, its scales intricately detailed in dark ink. But interspersed with the art were the remnants of his past, a puckered mark on his shoulder that looked like a bullet wound, and a long, faded slice across his ribs. His muscular frame spoke of a life governed by discipline and power, a body built for survival in a world where men fear his name. "You are staring," he said, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet room. He didn't sound angry. There was a flicker of amusement perhaps or approval in his piercing eyes. "I didn't realize that you were so marked," Nyla whispered, her voice barely audible. Taehyun stepped closer, the shadow of the dragon on his skin seeming to move with him in the dim light. He stopped inches from her, close enough for her to see the silver stubble on his sharp jaw, and smell the lingering scent of his expensive cologne. "Every mark has a price, Nyla," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers. "Some I paid in blood. Others, like you, I paid for in gold." The realization hit her with a fresh wave of terror. He wasn't just a man in a suit. He was a living map of every war he had won. As he reached out to trace the crimson accent at her neckline, Nyla understood that she was now a part of that map, a new territory claimed by a man who never lost what he chose to own. The space between them had vanished, leaving Nyla pinned between the unyielding glass of the window and the heat of Taehyun's scarred chest. The shadow of the dragon seemed to darken as he leaned in, his muscular frame casting a long, intimidating silhouette over her white dress. Nyla's hand was still pressed against his heart, and for a moment, she thought she could outrun the terror by sheer force of will. She looked up at him, her wide eyes searching his steel-gray gaze for a flicker of mercy, but she found only the cold, calculated resolve of a man who never left anything to chance. "You think this is just about a debt, don't you, Nyla?" Taehyun asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through her palms. "It is," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My father. The money. You bought me to settle the score." Taehyun tilted his head, his sharp jawline grazing the soft waves of her hair. He reached out, his hand sliding up her arm to the crimson accent at her neckline, his thumb tracing the red silk with a slow, agonizing precision. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned down until his lips were inches from her ear, the heat of his breath chilling her skin. "Your father didn't just lose money and soul," he murmured, the words dropping like stones into a deep well. "He lost his soul trying to hide what happened the night your mother died." Nyla's heart stopped. The air in the penthouse felt like it had been sucked out, leaving her gasping. She tried to pull back, but his grip on her waist tightened, a possession that was as much about secrets as it was about strength. "What are you talking about?" she choked out, though a dark, repressed memory began to claw at the edges of her mind. Taehyun leaned in even closer, his next words delivered in a whisper so cold it felt like a blade. "I didn't buy you to save your father from his creditors. I bought you because I am the only one who has the evidence that he was the one who pulled the trigger." The sentence shattered Nyla's world more completely than any wedding vow ever could. The fear that had been a dull ache was now a paralyzing ice. Her hand fell from his chest as the truth cracked open. Her savior was her jailer, and the man she had been trying to protect was the monster she had been running from all along. Taehyun pulled back just enough to look into her shattered eyes, his expression unreadable. "Now you understand," he said, his voice flat and final. "You aren't here for a marriage. You are here because as long as you belong to me, that evidence stays in my vault. If you leave, your father spends the rest of his life in a Korean cage." Nyla stared at the dragon on his neck, realizing she was no longer just a bride or a contract. She was a living silencer on a secret that could destroy her entire family. The revelation of her father's crime hung in the air like a poisonous fog, making every breath Nyla took feel heavy and shallow. She looked away from Taehyun, her eyes darting to the heavy oak door of the penthouse. For a fleeting second, she imagined bolting, running through the halls, taking the golden elevator down to the street, and disappearing into the neon labyrinth of Seoul. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll go to the police. I'll tell them everything about the debt, about the forced marriage, about him." Taehyun didn't move to stop her. He simply stepped back, crossing his arms over his broad, tattooed chest, and watched her with a clinical sort of pity. "Go then," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The door isn't locked, Nyla. But before you step out, you should know who is waiting in the lobby." He walked over to a sleek console and tapped a screen, bringing up the building's security feed. Nyla's blood turned to ice. Lingering near the entrance were 3 men in gray suits, the same men from the rival syndicate who had cornered her family at the gala. They weren't looking for a bribe. They were looking for blood. "My protection is the only reason they haven't burned your father's house to the ground with your sisters inside," Taehyun murmured, standing behind her so closely she could feel the heat of his body. "The police in this district are on their payroll, not mine. If you walk out that door, you aren't going to a station. You're going to a shallow grave, and your family will follow shortly after." Nyla stared at the screen, the gilded cage of the penthouse suddenly feeling like the only fortress left in the world. The luxury around her, the marble, the silk, the priceless art, wasn't just a display of wealth. It was the barricade between her and a violent end. She realized with a sickening jolt that her freedom didn't exist. Outside, there was only this shattered world her father had created. Inside, there was only the man who had claimed her. She turned back to him, her hand trembling as it rested on the cold glass of the window. "So I'm a prisoner either way." "You are a wife," Taehyun corrected, his voice dropping to that possessive hum as he reached out to tilt her chin up. "And in my world, the wife of Park Taehyun is the only person no one dares to touch. You can choose the danger outside or the security of my shadow. Which will it be, Nyla?" Looking into his steel-gray eyes, Nyla finally understood the trap. The bars of her cage weren't made of gold. They were made of her own bloodline's sins. She let out a jagged breath, her knees weakening as the reality of her total isolation set in. Nyla took a slow, shuddering breath, the kind that signaled the death of her old life and the birth of something much harder. She looked away from the security monitor and back to the man who now held the keys to her survival. The fear was still there, a cold weight in her stomach, but beneath it, a new heat began to flicker. If she was to be a prisoner in this gilded penthouse, she would not be a silent one. If she was a transactional asset, she would learn the value of her own currency. She stepped away from the window, her white silk train whispering against the marble floor like a warning. Taehyun watched her, his expression unreadable, his tattooed neck stark against the luxury of the room. He expected her to crumble, to weep, or to beg for mercy. Instead, Nyla reached up and slowly unclipped the subtle diamond earrings her father had given her, the last remnants of a family built on lies, and set them on the cold stone table. "I will stay," she said, her voice no longer trembling. It was flat, carrying a resonance that made Taehyun's eyes narrow in curiosity. "I will be the wife the park syndicate expects. I will wear your silk and sit at your table." Taehyun stepped closer, his muscular frame looming over her, but Nyla didn't flinch. She met his steel-gray gaze with a defiance that hadn't been there when they entered the golden elevator. "But do not mistake my presence for submission, Taehyun. You bought my silence and my safety, but you didn't buy my mind. If I am to be the boss's wife, I will learn every secret this house holds. I will know your enemies better than you do." A slow, dangerous smile tugged at the corner of Taehyun's mouth. It wasn't a smile of affection, but the grim satisfaction of a predator finding a mate with claws. He reached out, his thumb once again brushing the crimson accent at her neck, but this time Nyla didn't pull away. She leaned into the space, her eyes burning with a hidden spark of rebellion. "Good," he whispered, his voice a possessive hum that sent a different kind of shiver down her spine. "A dragon needs a queen who isn't afraid of the fire." Nyla looked out at the glittering lights of Seoul, realizing that while she was trapped, she was also shielded. She was the woman who knew the truth behind the Park Syndicate's power and her father's fall. As Taehyun's hand rested heavily on her shoulder, claiming her in the silence of the penthouse, Nyla vowed that she would eventually turn this gilded cage into a throne. The one sentence had frozen her in fear, but the reality of her new life was beginning to set her on fire.